Thank you. Geshey, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Yankee, and I'm with Kensei, and together we'll be moderating today's conversation. Today's event, in conversation with Dr. Thupten Jinpa, is presented by the Tibetan Canadian Cultural Center, where we will be exploring His Holiness's latest book, Voice for the Voiceless. Before we begin, we'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land we are on is Toronto, a Mohawk term for Toronto, which lies within the Dish with One Spoon territory. The original caretakers of the land are the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and it is now home to many Indigenous nations. Recognizing our own experience as Tibetans, exiled as a result of Chinese colonization of our land, Tibet, we are deeply grateful to have found a home here. And with that gratitude, we reflect on our positionality as settlers and on our ongoing responsibility to this land and its people. The book, Voice for the Voiceless, captures His Holiness's lifelong journey and legacy in seeking a peaceful resolution to the Tibetan cause. It also serves as a powerful reminder to the world of Tibet's ongoing unresolved struggle for freedom and the hardships that Tibetans continue to face in our homeland. I'd like to begin with a quote from the book, in which His Holiness recalls being invited to Beijing and meeting Chairman Mao, reflecting on that moment among Communist China's most senior leaders. His Holiness writes, "He was 61 years old to my 19. And here he's referring to Chairman Mao being 61 years old and His Holiness just 19. And I think this quote powerfully captures the kind of leadership position that His Holiness had to step into at such a young age. And as we read on, we witness his life trajectory from a nervous 19-year-old to now a 90-year-old, at 90 years old, who has not only led the Tibetan people and nation for his entire life, but also one of the most respected global figures of our time. We see that despite facing countless challenges, His Holiness remains steadfast in his commitment to nonviolence and dialogue, and becoming the guiding force for our people. Now, as he turns 90 years old, the responsibility to carry forward his legacy rests with us, especially the Tibetan youth. It is up to us to keep the hope of our nation alive and to embody the values that he has spent his life imparting to us. That is why today's event focuses on youth responsibility and leadership. We are excited to dive into the questions and activities that we have prepared today. With that, we thank you again for being here with us. We also extend our gratitude to the Tibetan Canadian Cultural Center for hosting this very important conversation. And of course, Geshey Thupten Jinpa, thank you for accepting our invitation. It is truly an honor to have you here with us today. I'd like to go through a brief overview of today's event. We begin with opening remarks by the TCCC President, Sonam Lankarla, followed by the keynote presentation by Geshey and a moderated discussion. After that, we will transition into small group discussions, followed by a Q&A session with the youth attendees today. I would now like to welcome the TCCC President, Sonam Lankarla, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Nandila Tashdale. We are deeply honored to welcome Geshey Thupten Jinpa to this important event at the Tibetan Canadian Cultural Center. Geshey has been closely associated with TCCC for decades, playing a fundamental role in shaping its spiritual and educational direction. Under the guidance and blessing of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Geshey developed the original vision for what became the Center for Tibetan and Buddhist Studies at TCCC in the year 2007. A vision rooted in the preservation of Tibetan culture spiritual education, and the cultivation of ethical values in our community. As an institution, the TCCC remains committed to the following the guidance and upholding the vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His teaching on compassion, non-violence, interfaith harmony, and universal responsibility continue to shape the direction of our program and community efforts. These talks reflect the same ongoing dedication. Over the years, Geshey has participated in numerous TCCC hosted public talks, workshops, and community meetings. His contribution have especially benefited the Tibetan youth, providing them with spiritual guidance, moral clarity, and an accessible bridge to the teaching of His Holiness. Today's event centered on the book Voice for the Voiceless by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, edited by Geshey. I do not want to go through details about the book, as our Geshey and the moderator will give you insight of it. In a special effort to inspire and empower the next generation, the TCCC actively reach out to community youth, inviting them to join the organizing committee in this event. We are proud to share that many young members of our community accepted this invitation with great enthusiasm. Their contributions have been vital in arranging today's talk. You will see several of them on stage today, taking a very important role, including moderators and support contributors. We also extend our heartfelt thanks to all the participants and facilitators for their time and dedication made this event possible. We also want to thank all the participants who are joining through live. We are confident that this talk will be meaningful for everyone here, and we hope it will deepen our collective understanding of the message of His Holiness while strengthening our community's commitment to His vision for the Tibetan people and the world. Dalai Lama. Thank you. 아니 대백이 한두 로 니슈 하잖아. 아니 원체로 그리지는 저보다 니시라 버로리야 대와 띵섭 유린의 도시를 찾으면래 아주 가데 글레 쪽이 다다버 아니 아주 기시라야 아니 슈니에다 레전드 제가 토네 비규 간데지 쇼바이나 기시라게 토제와 치비토네 켈레나네 두즈테네 데데스티네 마졸이야 카두이네 롭데 개표나와 텔이야 네 온체로 뱀이 용게 참슈니 기시라라 토지체나스 기슈니 원래 진짜 당아주 장제로 어서쪽에 고대기 토리야 아주 송지랍드림바 디슈야기 템베비오레 마음베 귤레 소레지 페와이네 로컬마 아주 도스체네 데데스체네 체야레 대송자 모두는 아주 계시라도 로데나로나스 디슈미 다데 아주기 레드 데다디 데베토라 아니 아주 단다 저도블라기 도스체네 대표마나 요레 딜레니암도 아니 다나시기 아주 고대기 체도 아니 로컬마 체도 아니 베트 아주 거기초기 거디 젠젠기 제림토라 아주 초기지 되는 도스체네 주요 대송자 아니 개변하는 정말로 도치 쉬어지다 아니 미마 용기 우리 주변 속에 레저 가르치 아니 근데 막 보지나 보이나 다들 새 토두머니 개변하여 어머발라 도지시 개변하는 마셔이 가르치 도치는
Since 1985, Geshey has served as a principal English translator for His Holiness of the 14th Dalai Lama, playing a key role in bringing Tibetan Buddhism to global audiences. He is the founding president of the Institute of Tibetan Classics in Montreal and general editor in Translation Series, dedicated to making classical Tibetan texts accessible to modern readers. An accomplished author, his works include A Fearless Heart, which introduces secular compassion training to a broader audience. And he is also the editor of The Voice of the Voiceless book, which we'll have a discussion on today, and a collection of his writings on Tibet. Dr. Jinpa is also a founding member of the Mind and Life Institute and chair of the Compassion Institute, and contributing to the dialogue between Buddhism, science, and modern ethics. His work continues to shape global understanding and Tibetan philosophy and contemplative practices. So we'd like to give this opportunity now to Geshey to Jinpa and begin his presentation. Thank you.
Testing. Yeah, okay. My fellow Tibetan brothers and sisters, it's a real joy to be here with you today. Can you hear well in the back? There's Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today, and I'm particularly looking forward to the conversation and discussion with the youth, because my understanding is that the questions that you have collected has been based on feedback and reflections and questions that has been generated as a result of many of you reading this book kind of at the same time. So this is the main part of our event today. But before that, let me say a few words in Tibetan, okay? And then we'll get back to the book itself. Tomange Talende Kanjan Chudeniya Kyabdo Jaje Nanabuto Je Kochum de Kabutu Tuche Shui Haborto Tanda Nema Tanda Yamani Borude Digi Kambe Gobada Zikoya Jaja To Tanya Kanji Tone Yaje Chisha the Sude Kambanabuje any Tandam Mazuke Munya Kalasa the Kanjan Chudeniya Jidan Shiri Joyo Haborto Gogela Pugri Shuna to Zutoya Saniment to Toya Temeki Lubuji Toya Malia the Lake Ledonchi Benation Zujera Gabia Munatanagi Jesu Rasha and Kantame Shebina Chang America Tsing Kantajik Java Pube Chiloya Sanan Chiganaya Pöde Tom Chishoji Toronto Chagore the Zingen Temutese Nikimen Mapuchon Mongole Tababibina Mongole Toronto Roma Chade or Das the Indigal Toronto Sakuki the Maranzu Tenjo Chizon Namoya Pumi the Chishoji Chade Dugalia Digi Toronto Yere Pumuto Chizo Chao Yuade Pebet Chigi Zaden Dang Meri Shun Sundu Chelia Shuji Joyo de Napa Chade Nezu Chavi Yore They do about Tanende and Kanda Jizo No Tumbu Shitabi Shen Mando Pegoto Gembe Chane Gyoji Karyo Slamatu Medo Gemba Tikiti Longsen Dang Shuru Dang the Deg Tone Chok Chong Den Che Usuju Yore the Tema Peria Manjulu Baslati Puji said the Deg Tone Chojin and Degi Tanja Shorje Mazu Ganges Yore and then they don't know Tubudu and a couple of Tajini Ulushunyana Shubi Shugi Zoya Marantu Yushun Chupu Navone Legitimate Mati Telamato Marantu Yushun Navone Yunji Chan Shengo Cheda Choden Cheda Diri Tudu Mati Materanos Yishu and Happort to Toronto area Yube Canadian Village Toby Chishu to Chavi Dugala Yaha Chiloria Bedus of Chavi the indicator of proof of concepts and proof of concept proof is that matter village to house of net money set that Yavana Lama to she or Chavi and Zan going to check out some Pigayori 말하는 시티에 별명 주수 피게요, 라프카 피게요. 대화 나올이야. 딱 마음발이야. 딱 밑동제 강내 스타나 너무 시 탑중마도 뭐 쓰대요 말아. 내 때문에 이제 되게 쉬워요. 되겠다. 딱 대화 치료야. 파고도 너무 롱발이야. 배배 되게 신고지 초어제. 나는 푸다가 외통에 쿵큐다 마셔다 사업주가 맞추세요. 그런 거 지금 딱 빼는 차이가. 그는 딱 그런 거 쉬울래 이제 뉴욕 지금 차이에 미니소타요래. 나는 이 당신 동안에 세계만 남았죠. 뭔가 싫어나. 말하는 배배지도 치료 차가 쉬울때 지도 코로나 불이야 차수도 말고 대중식 차인데 디인상本来내가 믹스에 가고 좀 내가 그런 거 중요해 우리 중요하게 제가 나도 동네 투시해 주니 배들에 막 그렇게 토는 저렇게 용말 편하게 용말 때 얘네 배바지 매잖아요. 배배를 중심도 다 균해다. 끼가 좀 차별이야. 나도 잘만 봐도 뭔가 지금 미보다 사실 잘 배워요. 진짜 하고 안에 그런 걸 써버려야 별로 치기요. 치기 누가 바로 시작 친구로 와. 그들이야 즉 치기를 요때 대학 시작도 때 미망하다 치기 시작이 민용한테 딱 바로 상당히 돼요 말에 그런 것도 찾아야나 뭔 시작을 체 차면 그래서 그들이 단행에 믹스에 손한 숙친구 좀 아니 병원 미세기 주대 간제 주대는 그냥 믹스에 토레 숙친구 나요. 그게 처음지다 쌓여게 봐요. 나도 제가 킹을 봐. 토레 숙친구 나요. 토레 숙친구 나 아니 네 간다지 게이를 그쇼를 벽이 개랑 그래 남초를 망고지기네 쉽게 소리야 간다 게지 림바도 틀었더니 목쟁이 같은 거 토해지다 투르는 프라카 제가 차지 림바를 싶으나 그래서 군주는 까나요 무슨 아무도 킹을 그래서 군주네 투르 숙식은 나요 땅에 군주기 고사도 슈투다 말에 얘네 최발 제가 군주 통내부용 그래 다는 내를 무슨 패면나 다른 대내당 간제 주된 내당 세면 우리 투기고 투기고 뭔가 인상 분주리게 라메데를 추진 그리고 라메데를 좀 만들 추가 필요 나오네 주변 추가 각신 그거 집에 추가돼 추가 개실 쓰기요 인상 단행에 내 부합성 이제 나보다 정말 투지 제시원이 마음 발라이네 간다 심슈 못트네 나로나 주시에 내용을 So I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and as someone who had the privilege to serve His Holiness as the main editor for this book, one thing that I was deeply touched was the way in which the younger generation of Tibetans truly engaged with this book. You know, I don't do social media myself, but I do have WhatsApp. So many of my colleagues and friends and family members send me the images of what was happening in the social media world, particularly from the younger members of our community, sharing their feedback, critical reflections of what they got out of this book. So this youth engagement with this book has been truly encouraging for me, particularly, and I also shared that with His Holiness when I was recently in India as well. And one of the things for me, of course, you need to read the book, and many of you have already read it. But this book should not be viewed simply as an autobiography of His Holiness, telling his story. Yes, of course, that's an important part of the book, which is autobiographical, because His Holiness was at the forefront of the movement right from the beginning, when China invaded Tibet from eastern Tibet in 1950, when he was forced or compelled to take on the leadership of a nation under attack. Since then, he has been at the driver's seat, as it were, and has witnessed the tragedy of the Tibetan nation over this long period of time. And His Holiness, and one of the things that you will learn from this book is the amazing courage of His Holiness. Yangila referred to this, His Holiness's first meeting with Chairman Mao. All of you are probably older than 19 years old, and you can look back to your own age when you were 19. Where were you? Imagine at that age being confronted with the leader of this massive nation called China, very aggressive, communist, country, who has just invaded your country and who has summoned you to Beijing, and to be confronted with that, the courage with which His Holiness has responded. And in fact, I read in one historical book written by a Chinese author, and according to her, Jiang Li, who sadly passed away last year, Jiang Li, based on study of the records of Chinese sources, tells the story when His Holiness met with Chairman Mao in this session. Both of them bowed in an equal fashion, and he did not kowtow. So there was this amazing courage and confidence on the part of this young His Holiness to be able to confront one of the most powerful leaders on earth. So His Holiness since then has really lived with the Tibetan struggle. He has personified Tibetan struggle. For over 8 years, he made attempts to seek some kind of accommodations within China based on assurances Mao Zedong gave, but it turned out to be completely unrealistic. It was just simply on paper. When the realization came that the struggle for Tibet has to be waged from outside, he left in 1959. And after 1959, if you look at the history of exiled Tibetan community, you can see the far-sightedness. Right from the beginning, His Holiness's first priority was not rebuilding the monasteries. It was establishment of modern schools for modern education of the youth. There was a long-term strategy, and then, thanks to Indian government's help, His Holiness was able to establish separate school systems for Tibetans, so the Tibetans don't get dispersed and disappear in this massive sea of people that is India. And then similarly, establishment of the Tibetan settlements in southern India and various parts of India is what ensured the viability of a small community of Tibetans. We were just at that time about 60, 70 or 80,000 people. 80,000 people sounds like a large number, but in nearly 1 billion India, it's nothing, it's a drop. But even then, we were able to survive as a distinct people with a pride in our heritage, in our language, in our culture, in our Buddhist tradition. That's all because of His Holiness's far-sightedness. And most importantly, His Holiness set the tone for our struggle. He could have chosen a path of self-pity, saying, oh, bad God, what a tragedy, we're so unfortunate, it's our bad karma, there's nothing we can do. We can go the self-pity route. Or he could have chosen the path of anger, hatred, revenge, and taken up arms. He did not do that. He showed us a middle way where we can take pride in our own heritage, confidence in who we are as a people, with a long vision of struggle, and continue and persist in our struggle. And he set that tone so that the Tibetans not only survived, but we thrived. Not only did we thrive, we were able to make offerings to the world. Look at all the Tibetan Buddhist centers across the world. These are all set up by Tibetan lamas. And then His Holiness's own engagement with the West, contemporary science, contemporary society, contemporary culture and thought, has given rise to a whole level of appreciation of Tibetan culture and its value, and so on. So I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, I was traveling, and a colleague of mine from Mind and Life, he's quite a big business person, and we were chatting, and then all of a sudden he talked about the size of Tibetan community in exile, and I said, we estimate it to be roughly around 150,000. And he was completely shocked. He said, what? Such a small number? How can you have such a huge imprint on the world? That is who we are. Of course, it's primarily thanks to His Holiness. So I think we Tibetans, yes, we are victims of tragedy. We lost our country. You know, we are in exile. But at the same time, we have not wallowed in self-pity. We have maintained our head high. And we have been able to also continually keep the issue alive. After more than 7 decades, 70 years since occupation, invasion, Tibetan issue still is alive. China, with all its power, with all its masses of military and population and economic power, has not been able to erase Tibet. You know, it tries. Right now, it's even refusing to call Tibet Tibet. It's calling Tibet Xizang, using a Chinese word. It tries everything. At one point, it tried economic incentives by, making Tibetans feel that they can make a lot of money in Tibet, economic development. But now they are trying to even erase the word Tibet. But the issue still remains. And one of the most important aspects of this book is for us to understand what is the essence of our struggle. We are a small population. We are never going to be able to succeed by waging an armed, struggle. If anything, it is the worst scenario because they will give the perfect excuse to wipe us out. You can see what's happening elsewhere in the world today. Just because certain sectors of the community resorted to violence, it has given the perfect license and excuse to commit massive amount of killing. So we're not going to do that, but at the same time, we can always question the presence of China on the plateau because Tibet belongs to the Tibetans. That is a historical fact. We Tibetans have been on this plateau, on the Tibetan plateau, for over thousands of years. Our history predates the Common Era. Our first king is Nyabisembo, which is before Common Era. Our written history starts from the 7th century. Since then, we have existed as a nation, as a people, with our distinct language. And what is happening today is tragic, but from a long-term view, it's a part of an ongoing, unfolding story. There is nothing written on stone saying that this is an unchangeable reality. So for us, the most important thing is we need to carry on. We need to have this long view. We always need to be sure in who we are. And here, Tibetan language, culture, and identity, particularly identity, is crucial. And that's why the younger generation, those who are in a free country like us, like ours here, I think each one of us really need to take this seriously. What does it mean to be Tibetan? So that your sense of Tibetan, yes, we are all Canadians here, but Canada is not a nation under struggle for its existence, even though some threats are being made. But Tibet is a nation that is under struggle, existential threat. And that is part of our identity, which we have to hold dear. And we need to pass it on to every generation, even if it takes 10 generations before we gain our freedom. That is the kind of long-term view we need to adopt. And for that, some ability to transfer across generation what it means to be Tibetan, or what Tibetan means to us. And part of that, His Holiness, although does not speak about it, but my sense is that one of the most important things is the emotional connection with land that is Tibet. Some of us may be fortunate to have gone there. I've never been able to go, although I was born. But we need to find a way to emotionally connect with Tibet as a land, as a country, and have a sense of ownership. And our identity of Tibetanness needs to be connected with our sense of ownership of that plateau. political, actual legal status, whether Tibet should gain independence or whether it can exist as an autonomy, is a secondary issue. It's a secondary issue. The fundamental issue is the survival, continued survival and thriving of Tibetans as a people. And this is where the great wisdom of His Holiness has shown us that for that, you don't need to insist on restoration of full independence. That it is possible within a framework of PRC, the Tibetans can survive and thrive as distinct people. Because if China is serious about its vision of People's Republic of China, that was established in 1949 as a composite of multiple nationalities, then Tibet, they should find a place for Tibet and Tibetans to be within that family. And within that multicultural, multinational family, it is possible. That's what His Holiness envisions for Tibetans as a people within that multi-nation state to exist as a distinct people with a custodianship of the land historically that we have, that has belonged to us. I think that really is the essence of our struggle. And one of the things that His Holiness has often said is that once you are convinced of the nobility of the cause, your commitment and dedication to the cause should not be contingent upon whether that goal could be achieved in my lifetime or not. Because if you are going to be engaging in something only if it can be achieved in your lifetime, then there is a selfishness attached to it. But if you are truly convinced of the nobility of the goal, then it shouldn't matter how long does it take for that goal to be realized. And when we are talking about a cause like Tibet, we're talking about the struggle of a people. Generations will come and go, but people remains, nation remains. So when we think of Tibet, we have to think of Tibetan as a people, Tibet as a nation. Nation can exist within a country. So the problem in Tibetan, we don't have a separate word for nation and country, but in English we do. And in English conception, it is not contradictory to have nationhood within a country. So if you think of United Kingdom, Wales and Scotland are nations within a United Kingdom, and that's why Wales and Scotland can send their representatives to the Olympics, representing their nations. So Tibetans, we should, even though we are not asking for full independence, but we should not give up the idea of Tibet as a nation. So this, I think, is really crucial. And we, as we go into future, there will come a time when His Holiness will be not around. We need to make sure that His Holiness and the institution continues to symbolize both the people and the nation. That is the symbol. And when we engage in struggle, our struggle is not just for protection of human rights. Our struggle is for the survival and thriving of a nation and a people. I think so. That's why I wanted to take this opportunity to, reach out particularly to the younger generation. These days you have access to quite a lot of rich resources on Tibet, its history, and as much as possible, the younger generation should really take the time and opportunity to really study Tibetan history, so that you have a much richer understanding of the complexity of our history, and you are coming from a place of confidence when you speak about nationhood of Tibet. Up to now, the elder generation have had the luxury of the active presence of His Holiness as a symbol traveling around the world. So long as we don't fight among ourselves, we were kind of quite successful because His Holiness was the face of our movement, of our struggle, of our culture, of our civilization. And everybody, wherever His Holiness goes, everybody knows the Dalai Lama of Tibet. So we had a much easier job, the elder generation, when we are continuing with our struggle. The younger generation will have a tougher time. The younger generation would not have the luxury of that kind of powerful symbol. So then, the strength of our struggle has to be based on merit, based on our ability to project the story, tell our story, own our story. When the time comes that our story cannot be told by ourselves and has to be told by someone else, we would have lost. So Tibetan, we have to ensure that we own the narrative. We are the masters of our own destiny. The story that we tell, the story that the world believes about Tibet has to be the Tibetan version. And this is, in essence, our struggle with China is a struggle of narrative. We are not going to go back to Tibet and fight with guns. Our struggle is a struggle of narrative. Whose version, up to now, thanks partly to His Holiness, so far as the international community is concerned, the story that everybody knows about Tibet is our version. It's the version, and it's the truth. Fortunately for us, it's the truth. But just because something is true does not mean it's the one that is going to be accepted. But our job is to always make sure that when the story of Tibet is told, it is not the version told by our oppressors. That, in a nutshell, is the essence of our struggle. And the younger generation, you don't have to join CTA to do the struggle. Each one of you, in your own capacity, through writing, through blogging, through responding to the articles that are appearing in major newspapers, whatever opportunity you find, narrative is the key. Narrative power, and owning that narrative really has to be the key. So that's one thing I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much. Okay.
So we have prepared some questions through an organizing committee. We have been deliberating this book for a month, and we also sent a web form out to all the participants who are registered today. And through selecting questions and filtering it out, we have come up with a few questions that we're going to ask you today. Following My Land and My People and Freedom in Exile, Voice for the Voiceless is His Holiness' third book where he recounts his journey as a leader of the Tibetan nation and people and chronicles his decades-long effort to resolve Tibetan issues with the Chinese leadership that have come and gone. So my question is, in your view, how does this book speak to or depart from his previous autobiographies? What prompted His Holiness to write this book at this very particular moment?
So thank you for the question. One simple answer is when the second autobiography of His Holiness, Freedom in Exile, was published, there was only the first round of dialogue that has happened. And the second round of dialogue began in 2002 and ended in 2010. So that part of the story is not there. And furthermore, in the first two books, it's more written in the style of an autobiography, telling His Holiness' story, which is, of course, Tibet is a struggle of Tibet, for Tibet is the major part of it, but not the entirety. One of the main reasons for this book is, in addition to updating on where we were, or where we are, with respect to discussion with China, it's also the aim of the book, from His Holiness' point of view, is to have a single place where he puts together the entirety of what he sees as the important element of the struggle that he has led, and what are his aspirations for the future, and where, despite the two rounds of dialogue, how is it that it hasn't led to any meaningful kind of, resolution, and what are the stumbling blocks? So in that sense, this book is, it not only tells the story in its entirety, but also it's a kind of a testimony of His Holiness, putting on record, what are all of his efforts have made, but also what are his aspirations for the future and his confidence in the longevity of the struggle. And the reason why it came out this year is more of a coincidence. This year is a big year for the Tibetan people because he's turning 90. But the plan, the decision to write this book actually was taken a couple of years earlier. But generally the writing takes longer, and it just happened to coincide nicely. And since I had the privilege to serve as his main editor, I wanted to make sure that it came in the year when he's turning 90.
Thank you, Geshey. So Voice for the Voiceless is a call to advocacy, and we can all agree that no one in this world has embodied that role for the Tibetans inside Tibet more fully than His Holiness, who has dedicated, like you said, his entire life representing their voices. And for the wider exile community, however, the reality is that the longer we remain in exile, the more we worry about a growing disconnect between Tibetans inside Tibet and those of us outside. And despite living in a global age of internet, Tibet, as we all know, remains in a blackout with very little information that comes out, and the ones that do are tightly controlled by Chinese surveillance and censorship. So in this context, Geshey, how can Tibetans in exile meaningfully sort of carry forward His Holiness's legacy, and you talk about the importance of carrying on that legacy, and how can we continue to be the voice for those inside Tibet?
Thank you. That's a major issue, and I think, on the part of those of us who are in exile, we're in a free country where we have the ability to express ourselves. So because of this, it places upon us quite an important moral responsibility. Now, if we don't identify with people back home, if we don't view ourselves as Tibetans, then it's something else. So long as you identify yourself as a Tibetan, then your connection with Tibet as a land, and Tibetans living in our homeland, whether you like it or not, the connection is already there. So with that connection and identity comes a responsibility to really speak on behalf of the people back home. I think, I don't think we are ever going to have a systematic communication between people back home and people in exile community. Even up to this point, the communication was never systematic or institutionalized. And it's not something that is going to be allowed by current PRC, because the whole kind of structure and ethos of PRC is that of control. Control of narrative, control of information going in and out. But people inside Tibet has shown their resilience over 6 decades without His Holiness's full presence on the plateau. Generations have changed. Many of the people who are at the forefront of struggle inside Tibet, they have never seen His Holiness. They have never seen independent Tibet. For them, but the fact that they are Tibetans, their identity and the language they speak makes them feel a sense of responsibility and advocate for their people. So the Tibetans inside Tibet has really shown their resilience. The fact that China is still struggling inside Tibet to the point where, what we see today in Tibet is nothing but a colonial homeland. All the decisions are made in Beijing, executed by top leader who's not a Tibetan, and then carried out by Tibetan deputies. If that is not colonialism, what is? So the fact that they have never found full confidence in Tibetans to be running the show on the ground according to their plans and aspirations is a powerful testament to the fact that Tibetans have kept their identity as a separate people. So I think, you know, the up to now, the connection between Tibetans inside Tibet and outside Tibet has been primarily through His Holiness. Devotion and loyalty to His Holiness. You know, the Chinese banned the display of His Holiness's photograph in Tibet, but they can't take the image of His Holiness in the heart of Tibetans because they can't see inside the heart. And they can't force Tibetans to forget His Holiness. So He has been the powerful connector. In future too, when there is going to be a 15th Dalai Lama, Dalai Lama name has to be the symbol that links Tibetans back home and Tibetans outside. And those who were in the outside world will also need to prove to those inside Tibet that we are speaking on their behalf. Because if we fight among ourselves, it's an embarrassment. I mean, like, then how can they trust us if we are fighting among ourselves? You know, repeating the same kind of regionalism and conflicts that we used to have in Tibet outside. So we have to show unity, we have to prove ourselves, but the glue that connects us and the people back home will be the vision of Tibet, symbol of His Holiness, and our language. That is the strength.
Yeah, following up with your answer, in this book, His Holiness offered a detailed account of his decades-long effort to find a peaceful resolution of the Tibetan issue with the Chinese leadership since the invasion, from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, and his feeling of disappointment and frustration at the consistent lack of courage and political will shown by the successive Chinese leaders to engage meaningfully are palpable throughout this book. Meanwhile, the situation inside Tibet has only worsened. In exile, the Tibetan movement has, for everyone that is kind of noticeable by now, has kind of waned and is kind of in a sense of despair. And at times, even indifferent. A lot of people show indifference towards the cause within our own people. So my question is, so as His Holiness clearly understands the reality, which is why he speaks to his book, and reminds us that the issue of Tibet is an existential one, and we don't have the luxury of giving up. Can you share about lessons from His Holiness' life through this book that we can draw, especially younger generations who may feel this sense of despair?
I think His Holiness, of course, there is a whole chapter in the book which is where he explains the practices in Buddhism that gave him strength, especially when he's struggling and feeling down because of the hopelessness of the situation. So there are issues that, kind of teachings that we can draw on. But I think His Holiness, towards the end of the book, His Holiness makes an appeal to different sectors, especially to the Tibetan people. And he reminds us of the resiliency that is in the Tibetan nationhood. And I think this is important. We Tibetans have survived on the plateau as a distinct people, as a nation for over 2,000 years. So if that is the case, there must be something in the gene of the Tibetan people that allows us, and His Holiness reminds us that the Dalai Lama institution is only 500 years old. Tibetan nation is older, at least by 1,500 years. So there is a resiliency. Right now, yes, institution is important, it's the symbol. But in the end, His Holiness is saying there is a power in the distinctness of Tibetans as a people. And so the most important thing for us is to ensure, it doesn't matter where we are living. As a people, we need to ensure that identity of distinctness as a people. And that is, in the end, a matter of storytelling. Storytelling, the story of Tibetan people and the narrative has to be always maintained. I think His Holiness is, in the immediate situation when we are feeling down, there might be Buddhist teachings that are helpful, we can apply so that we don't feel completely discouraged. But then we also need to step back and take a bigger view of history and see our situations as unfolding within that longer narrative, and always remember that we have survived and thrived as a distinct people over 1,000 years, more than 2,000 years. So I think that kind of going back and forth is something that we need to do. Because sometimes if you are fixated by only the present problem, you don't see an end in sight. Then that becomes your just small, narrow reality. And that fixation on narrow reality can really weigh you down, because you don't see the end. Whereas if you're able to put that situation in a larger context, then you see nothing lasts forever. The Chinese communist rule may seem very powerful, but there's nothing written down in law that says this is going to last forever. And for us Buddhists, and His Holiness reminds us, especially for us Buddhists who believe in the principle of impermanence, we know nothing lasts forever. So this ability to step back and recognize the truth of impermanence so that we don't feel completely overwhelmed. And those kind of things are important. And so this is why I think the younger generation, needs to be smarter in approaching this whole Tibetan struggle issue. Up to now, we have relied heavily on the institutionalized approach with the presence of His Holiness as the main focus. Moving forward, time will come when the approach needs to be democratized. And here, I think, if you look at different people struggling, many people that are struggling did not have the luxury of a unifying symbol like His Holiness. We were lucky. For 60 years, we had that unifying symbol, which made it much easier for us as a people to rally around. But now we need to be smarter. And here, I think the younger generation, let me take the opportunity to reach out to younger generation, especially those who have inclination and capacity for more humanities kind of approach, like history or philosophy or anthropology or social science. Please do not think that if I don't take a professional course in my university, I'm not going to be successful in life. We need historians, we need political scientists, so that we have novelists. Some of the most important struggle movements have been inspired by storytelling. So I think we, the younger generation, needs to have a much more sophisticated understanding of how struggles can be waged without relying on a centralized approach. So that's one thing I wanted to say.
Hello. So, Ishla, in this book, His Holiness speaks a lot about the middle way approach and how it came to be, and how it offered as a mutually beneficial solution that seeks genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people, and ensuring the survival of our identity, language, and culture. He also shares how tirelessly and relentlessly he's worked to engage the Chinese leadership through this very approach. And my question to you is, Geshey, what do you think His Holiness would want to know? What do you think His Holiness would want young Tibetans to understand about the spirit of the middle way approach? And how can younger generations best carry it forward, given that it is the current official policy of the Central Tibetan Administration? And I ask this, Geshey, just because I feel like a lot of us are not able to understand the approach, and I think His Holiness emphasizes a lot within the book. So if you could sort of provide a bit more about this approach.
Well, I think, a few things. One of the main reasons for His Holiness is urging us and showing us the path of middle way is a practical perspective. Because right from the beginning, if you insist on restoration of Tibetan independence, there's no starting. And His Holiness's belief is that in the final analysis, the resolution of the Tibetan struggle, the Tibetan problem, has to be achieved on the basis of two sides coming to sit down and negotiating and discussion. So if that is the case, then the successful approach would require both sides taking into perspective the position of the other side. And this is one area where His Holiness said that what matters to PRC most is the territorial integrity and stability. But what matters to us Tibetans most is the ability to survive and thrive as a distinct people. And he sees there is a possibility where those two objectives can be met. And here, he believes that middle way approach is the most effective. And also, one of the things that we have to remember is that many of the international support for Tibetan struggle, whether they're explicitly stated or not, is premised upon our approach being that of middle way. This is a fact. Whether we like it or not, this is a fact. Because the moment the Tibetan established institutional approach, in other words, CTA approach, shifts from middle way to campaigning for full independence, the rules of the game will change. Because many nations that have been supportive of our struggle up to this point have done this on the basis that the Tibetans were not seeking full separation from PRC. And if the Chinese complain, they are in a strong position to say, we are not supporting separatism. We are supporting a people's quest to survive and thrive as a distinct people. So those are important things we need to take into account. So I think this is not something His Holiness has said in the book, but my sense is that even if China becomes democratic, so imagine in a best scenario case, China becomes democratic. China will be ruled by ethnic Chinese. And for ethnic Chinese, even democratic ones, it would be very difficult to envision total separation of Tibet from the People's Republic of China. So we have to take all of this into account. So I think His Holiness's suggestion is that so long as we are seeking resolution of the problem through negotiation, we have no choice but to take into account the consideration of the other side. And here, middle wave approach is the only way to go. And I think, and the middle wave approach does not mean we recognize Tibet was historically part of China. His Holiness up to this point have never admitted, on occasions the Chinese side has demanded that he make a public statement that Tibet has always been part of, since ancient time, part of China. His Holiness has said no. That is history. Historical status cannot be decided by politicians or through politics. Historical status has to be understood and determined by historians based on evidence of a given period. But future direction, future status can be decided through political discussion. So His Holiness has never admitted that Tibet was historically a part of China. And furthermore, in the middle way approach, there is the envisioning of the possibility of Tibetans remaining within the PRC, with the understanding that PRC is a modern composite nation, is a multi-nation country. Within that, Tibetans can live as one nation among many nations. So I think those are important subtleties that sometimes Tibetans unfortunately don't understand. Mainly because many Tibetans don't read beyond Tibetan text. That's the problem. You know, you have to have a much richer understanding of history, nuances, what is the thinking behind a certain position, and what does it mean for Tibetans to be within Tibet to be within the PRC, and what does it mean for Tibet not having been part of historically China. So those are, even though name China, if you look at history, name China applies to different sizes of country. You know, between Tang Dynasty and Song Dynasty, there is a big difference. Between Yuan, which is a Mongol, and then Ming, which is an ethnic Chinese, there was a big difference. During the Ming period, they had no control at all in Tibet. To the point when Jesongkapa was invited, at least on 2 occasions, Jinpa refused. You know, he declined the invitation. Now, if Tibet was part of China, how can a Tibetan Lama decline an invitation from the emperor? So you can see the word China, and on the Chinese side, they try to give this image of a continuity of the same huge nation. But that is a fiction. But we Tibetans need to understand our own history, and particularly the complicated history of relationship between Tibetans and our big nation, China, on the other side. So Tibet is a landlocked country. We have Nepal and India on the southern side. We have Central Asian countries on the northern side. We have Chinese on the eastern side. You know, other countries. So Tibet is a landlocked nation, and during the imperial period, large part of Central Asia was under the Tibetan Empire. Huge areas of China were under the Tibetan Empire. The whole Tonghang region. The reason why Tibetan texts were discovered in Tonghang caves is because that area of China remained under Tibetan rule for nearly 100 years. So it's the long history goes back and forth, and the younger generation of Tibetans, especially those who are in the West, we really need to make efforts to understand our history. The relationship and history is complicated. We cannot say, that we have always, remained powerful. We were powerful once, but nations and neighbors, they always have complicated relationships. So I think those things we have to understand. So that when people think about middle way versus independence, you need to situate that debate within the broader context. It cannot be purely an emotional issue. If it is purely an emotional issue, there's not a single Tibetan who does not want independence. If it is just an emotional question, everybody will say, we want independence. I don't know a single Tibetan, if they are given the choice, that would say, I don't want independence. It's not an emotional issue. The debate is about what is the best course of action for us who are waging a struggle.
Yeah, definitely need more readings and understand different perspectives to get a more nuanced understanding of the Tibet issue. And talking about middle way and all the approaches, lining along with, towards the end of this book, His Holiness writes that while there has been no meaningful breakthrough with the Beijing government, what gives him hope is the relationship between Tibetan and Chinese people. He recalls having meaningful dialogue with the Chinese brothers and sisters, which he says reinforced his belief that so long as Tibetan and Chinese avoid the path of mutual hatred, there will always be bias for finding a genuine understanding between our two people. So our question is, what might that kind of understanding look like in practice, and how can Tibetans of exile carry forward this approach in their own community and advocacy work?
One of the things that His Holiness talks about in the book is that in the wake of 2008, when the Summer Olympic torches were relayed, those who are old enough will remember there was a lot of protest worldwide, starting from Athens when the torch was first lit and passed on. And His Holiness talks about, in the book at that time, because there was a lot of protest inside Tibet, there was, in the Chinese state media, a kind of a demonization of Tibetans. And to the point where there was a high rise of racism in mainland China against Tibetans. Many Tibetans, when they wanted to buy a car, they were refused. Hotels refused to rent rooms and so on. So there was a racism. So His Holiness immediately appealed to the Chinese people, wrote a letter asking them not to turn this struggle and conflict into a struggle between two people. He's saying it's a struggle, it's against a regime, not against the people. So I think this distinction between regime and a people is an important one. And His Holiness in the book several times reminds the reader that between Tibetans and Chinese, we share the heritage in Mahayana Buddhism. Some of the texts in Tibetan Kaidu and Bengal are translated from Chinese. And many Tibetan lamas have gone to China. So there has been a lot of relationship. So His Holiness feels, and then he also talks about how at that time there were almost 1,000 or over 1,000 articles written by Chinese scholars about expressing their sympathy for the cause of the Tibetans, the need for Tibetans to exist as a distinct people. So His Holiness's, belief here is that the more educated Chinese come to understand the true story and the nature of Tibetan struggle, they will come to empathize and sympathize with our struggle. Now, if we are seeking total separation, that may be a different matter. But if we are seeking an ability to survive and flourish as a people, then clearly the educated Chinese, after all, they are human beings too. They will see the justness of what we are asking. And so I think this is what His Holiness is. He talks about how in the end, by connecting with each other's humanity, that we can come to a resolution. So I think this is, even though His Holiness does not say so, I would say one of the most important target audience for this book is the educated Chinese. To really make the other Tibetan people asking for, why are they so persistent over so many decades and consistent in their, demand? And similarly, another important target for this volume are the policy advisors in different parts of the world. Every nation, including especially in the free country, given the importance of China as a major economic partner, needs to have a policy, foreign policy, that has a China desk. And the moment you have a China policy, you need to have some understanding of where does Tibet fit in. So, at least from my perspective, another important constituency or readership of this volume are those people who are going to be advising policies of different governments, at least to have an understanding of a full version from His Holiness's side, telling the story. Then, of course, Tibetan readership, and the Tibetan translation is being done. It should be available by end of this month, in time for His Holiness's birthday. And the Chinese and the Tibetan version are going to come out around the same time. And again, very important audience is the Tibetan people, especially inside Tibet, so that they understand the full story of His Holiness's thinking behind the middle way, his belief, his confidence, and his continued kind of aspiration.
I just want to be mindful of time because we have group discussions where we will explore some of the themes even further. But I do have one last question for you, Geshey. You've collaborated on so many books with His Holiness over decades, and mostly on spiritual books. How was your experience different working on this book with His Holiness? And were there any moments or stories during the process that struck you that you would like to share with us today? And that will be the end.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I've been very, very fortunate to have the privilege to serve His Holiness for so long. I began in my 20s as a young monk, and I happened to be fortunate because I left school after grade 4 and became a monk. So the English capacity that I had was largely self-taught. Because in India, after grade 4, you can't speak English. So I kind of taught myself, and by the time in my late 20s, when I had the opportunity to be in Dharamsala, I was speaking reasonably good English. Not that well, but at least working English. So I ended up having the accidental privilege of serving His Holiness as a translator for one teaching, which then opened up a whole opportunity, completely changed my life. So I had the privilege to serve him, and on many books. And the word collaboration is not the right word actually. I'm serving him. His Holiness doesn't have the time to sit down and write everything in English. But I serve him as his pen, and basically interview him, have a conversation, prepare the manuscript, and then change it and improve it. And it's been a real privilege. All these other books, to be honest, it was way easier. This was a tough one. Because other books which are more like His Holiness's teachings, spiritual teachings to the world, and I've traveled with him extensively, when His Holiness has given many public talks, and I can kind of, envision the trajectory of his thinking. But this book tells his personal story of his struggle for the people. And as a Tibetan also, it was emotionally more challenging because I identify strongly with the struggle he represents and he has led. And in many aspects of His Holiness's life, he has been hugely successful, influential, impactful. On the question of actual resolution of the Tibetan people, he has not met with the success that he hoped. He has been tremendously successful in leading us, leading the people, representing the struggle, ensuring that it stays alive. The struggle between His Holiness and China is like the modern version of David and Goliath. On the side of His Holiness, only thing that he has, his voice, his moral authority to represent the Tibetan people, and his steadfast commitment to non-violence and clarity of his vision. But on the other side is a massive military might with the increasing economic power. So it's a David and Goliath. But at the same time, if you look at it, in the entire history of People's Republic of China, probably for them, the most challenging and difficult adversary has been His Holiness. The entire nation, entire leadership, in the moral conflict between Tibet, His Holiness, and China, His Holiness has won the moral victory. Of course, he would have preferred if it has ended in a resolution of the problem. So to see this and the efforts he has made by helping him, assisting on the book, and recognizing that he has not left a single stone unturned. As far as he's concerned, even an educated Chinese, if they read this book, they will know whose side to be blamed for the failure of resolution of the Tibetan struggle. On his part, he has done everything that he could. So I think seeing all of this, even though I knew, but now assisting him in putting them in words, was a painful process. But also, there's a lot at stake for this volume, because the voice for the voiceless represents both nation and people. Voice of the nation and voice of the people. So in the Tibetan version, His Holiness chose the title Pödan Pömi Dinsap in the English, because in Tibetan, literal translation of Dimenam Dinsap doesn't mean anything, because there isn't that kind of traditional custom of talking about in such phraseology. So the version he chose for the Tibetan version is Pödan Pömi Dinsap. So he has been the voice for both the nation of Tibet and the Tibetan people. So I think for us, when we talk about the Tibetan struggle, we always need to bring Tibet and its people, Tibet and the Tibetan people, Pödan Pömi, the nation and people. We really need to bring them together. Nationhood does not mean an independent country. So I think, so for me, this was probably one of the hardest books that I've assisted him in writing. The word political, has to be understood in the right context, the right way, when we apply it to His Holiness's work. So, political in the sense of representing a struggle of a people and being their voice is what we mean by political here, not in the sense of party politics or politics in another sense. So, for His Holiness, my understanding is that, and in fact he says in the book, saving Tibet is a noble work, is the work of Dharma. And Dharma, Buddhist belief, is the source of happiness for all sentient beings. So I think for His Holiness, he has always said the survival of Tibet, although it is directly related to a people, distinct people, but its implication goes beyond Tibetan people. He's often always said that struggle for Tibetan freedom is not about him as an individual. So when the Chinese presented him with a proposal that relates to his status, his power, his future, his privilege, he says, no, the issue is not about the Dalai Lama, the issue is about the Tibetan people. So I think, it comes through quite powerfully, even when he's explaining difficult political processes, that he's always bringing this personal bodhisattva perspective in his understanding of that situation, because his motivation is always to help, always to benefit sentient beings. So there are specifically personal voice in certain parts of the book when he steps back in one of the chapters and talks about the practices that he finds helpful in the face of dealing with suffering. So those are very personal, but those are deliberate steps where he's taking a step back. So for example, those of you who have read the book will notice, for example, after the loss of Tibet and coming into exile, he takes a step back and he presents a geopolitical reflection. How do we understand the loss of Tibet within the broader geopolitical context of a history at the time? He talks about the fact that we were unlucky because the loss of Tibet, invasion of Tibet, happened soon after newly independent India gained its freedom. So India was not in a strong position to advocate for Tibet. US had just supported the nationalist government Kuomintang, that was the losing side against the communists. So they were only interested in prevention of communism, not in support of the Tibetan people. The British country, United Kingdom, who has had the closest connection with Tibet because of its initial invasion of Tibet in 1904, 1903, the Young Husband expedition. His Holiness says that UK could have been more empathetic because of their historical understanding of Tibet, but they chose not to because they had just gone through the decolonization process. So the last thing they wanted was to get involved yet again in Asia. So there is a stepping back and looking at the big picture. So sometimes you see these deliberate chapters where he's stepping back and giving the big picture, at least from his side. How do we understand what has just happened? He's saying when he left Tibet, he was not in a position to understand this because there were immediate needs to save the Tibetan people, help the Tibetans who are in exile. After things settled down, he had the ability to look back. So then the chapter on dealing with suffering is another step back. It's more like a spiritual perspective on how do I deal. So His Holiness, those of you who know him well, we know he's a very practical person. He doesn't wallow too much on self-pity or sadness. He just wants to deal with the problem at hand. So I think you can see different voices in the book, some of which are much more personal, emotional, and some of which are more rational. So I think it's good when you're reading, you should allow yourself to feel that. The narrative moves from personal to the reflective to more rational and so on.
To be a leader as a young Tibetan today, and why is it important? So if we could have that group, youth leadership. Okay, great.
As a young Tibetan today, and why is it important? So basically, we talked about the challenges and opportunities. So some challenges are that these days there's many things happening in the world, and a lot of people don't know about Tibet, and a lot of people never heard about Tibet, and a lot of governments, we feel like there's not much support and not much action happening. And also we've had 7 decades of struggle, which is a really long time, and it feels like the problem is fading away. But some opportunities are that we live in a free country and there's freedom of speech, so we can express our voice and share our knowledge about Tibet and basically tell the world what's happening. And basically, to summarize what we talked about is, we said we can share our story, speak up for ourselves, be vocal, and not just about political history, but also protect our culture and learn our culture, and also we should understand our history. That's what we talked about, and we could share to other people and tell them what's going on in Tibet and our struggle for freedom. And lastly, we said that all Tibetans are awareness activists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll now move on to the next group, which is representing Tibetans inside Tibet. His Holiness has been the bridge between Tibetans in exile and those inside Tibet. He has worked hard to be the voice for those inside Tibet who cannot speak freely. Today, as surveillance and repression remain at their peak in Tibet, how do we continue to represent and stay connected with our people inside? So if we could have the group representing Tibetans.
So to address this question, we've come up with 3 umbrella points. 3 umbrella points being social advocacy, cultural preservation, and self-awareness. Under those 3, they kind of all connect in a sense. I'll just provide some specific points. Some of us mentioned advocating and spreading the word online, whether through petitions, signing bells. The preservation of culture and identity through entrepreneurship. So whether that be starting businesses, organizations, or just teaching or being involved in other organizations that are proactively engaged in the Tibetan cause. And we've also talked about diversifying our way of thinking. So it's not only about us as Tibetans, but we live in the West, and so there's a lot of cultures around us, and so we have to communicate with other cultures as well. And once we start diversifying our way of thinking, we have a broader mindset through which we can combat that Tibetan issues. And then one last thing we said was being more aware of geopolitics, because it's always shifting. And so I think the previous CTO had mentioned, to know Tibet is to know China. And so if we know China very, very well, then we know Tibetans very, very well.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to unity. So His Holiness has been a unifying force across Tibet and the diaspora. He has always emphasized unity across the 3 provinces of Tibet, across generations and among those in exile and those inside Tibet. But in today's world, it's easy to become divided by politics, by language, region, and social media echo chambers. How can Tibetan youth carry that spirit of unity and build stronger communities in today's world? So if we could have the unity group, okay, great.
There's a big divide between regions in Tibet and the language that we speak, and we think that we should just be more accepting of each other, especially in America and Canada. We think there's a big fear of judgment or kind of being embarrassed to speak Tibetan because they think they don't know it enough, or they can't speak it properly, or they might have an accent. So we feel that there's kind of a divide between even where Tibetan people are born, whether it's India, Nepal, or even in Canada. So I think working towards dialogue is really important, and having opportunities in community centers, having platforms for Tibetans to connect, and kind of political or even government programs for Tibetan youth is important. And one of our members even mentioned when they went kind of back to their shijak in India, they were saying that the Tibetan youth in Canada are doing very well in preserving culture and language, and they even get inspired and look up to us. So I think that's something for all of us to be proud of, that at least we're trying, right? Even though we're born in Canada, we feel disconnected, we're still trying. So how can we play a role in promoting unity? I think as a youth, appreciating things like Geshey, which is a big thing right now, and proposing programs that include youth more and give youth the chance to ask questions and participate in dialogue, and discussions like this today are really important.
We'll now move on to democracy. So one of His Holiness's most visionary decisions was to voluntarily hand over his political power to an elected leadership. It showed his conviction in democracy and the Tibetan people's ability to govern ourselves. But democracy only works when people participate. How can Tibetan youth honor this vision? By taking active roles in our democratic process and sharing responsibility for the Tibetan future.
Well, our topic is democracy, And one way Tibetan youth can carry forward His Holiness' vision of democracy is being open to a broad perspective, especially on social media. Instead of reacting with hate and bad words, we can respond to it with facts and being open to constructive feedback. Following on, the importance of Tibetan government in exile, plus its functions, how it informs the youth about it. In addition, everyone has conflicts. As for Tibet, we use our type of the middle point, but that might not always go for others. In the end, though people/nations have conflicts, there is always a solution, which would mean every issue has their own middle point.
Responsibility. In the book, His Holiness says, Tibetans rely on me too much. He spent decades encouraging us to become less dependent on him and more empowered as individuals and communities. As he turns 90 this year, how can we now begin to share and step into that responsibility? It's shared responsibility.
We chose another topic. It was Tibet on the global stage. It's a poster. But I'll just say the context. His Holiness the Dalai Lama helped transform Tibet from a little-known place to a symbol of global moral leadership by connecting our struggle to wider issues like environmental protection, peace, nonviolence, justice, as well as to the promotion of Buddhism. And our topic was Tibet on the global stage. Our main question was, how do we, as young Tibetans, continue this work of making Tibet visible and relevant in the world today? And so our main goal we tried to tackle was how to make Tibet visible and relevant on the global stage today. And we realized that the initial problem we have to overcome is our own community engagement, our own engagement with Tibetan youth. Firstly, to allow Tibetan youth to cultivate their identity rather than repress it or, get distracted in the Western world that we are in today. We can do this by developing programs that allow Tibetans to cultivate their identity. And something that I think is really important is to encourage Tibetan youth to participate in community activism, whether that's through VTAG, Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group, or SFT, Students for a Free Tibet. I think I see a lot nowadays, Tibetan youth simply saying, free Tibet, but rather than participating in the local groundwork of Students for a Free Tibet or VTAG. So I think we need to encourage youth to participate in these events, to cultivate their identity. Secondly, how can we allow Tibet to enter the global stage? We thought about two different mediums of this. Firstly being social media strategy. Secondly, political lobbying, advocating to politicians. We can do this by a really important thing that we thought about was connecting the Tibetan issue to other global issues that are happening in the world. For example, the current US administration, there's been a threat to democracy and a rise of dictatorship in the US. And what's happening is the current administration are taking away human rights, freedom of speech in the US Constitution. And we can connect that to what has been happening in Tibet for over 70 decades, the erosion of free speech in Tibet, human rights abuses, connecting that long-term Tibetan issue to the relevancy of modern-day issues is key to allowing Tibet to be recentered in the global stage. And again, doing this through social media advocacy. And again, what you, Thupten, Jinpa said, the most prevalent problem in the Tibetan issue is controlling our narrative. I think we can very much do this through, as today's very modern age, social media advocacy. I think as a model, as an example, is a specific Instagram account called Students for Free Tibet International. They have gained over 15 million views on their social media through strategic social media strategy. And they do this through video form and other kinds of forms. And I think, again, through relating the Tibetan issue to modern global issue and the medium through social media strategy is key to controlling our narrative in the global stage. Thank you.
Thank you.
A different title to debate on the global stage, which is equally important. I think you answered this question as well, the shared responsibility of social media advocacy and strategies that we can adopt as we move forward. We'll now go to the next group, continuity beyond His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His Holiness has been the heart of the Tibetan people for decades, spiritually, politically, and symbolically. But he has also prepared us for a future beyond him. What does that future look like for Tibetans and the Tibetan struggle? And what role can youth play to ensure the Tibetan movement and identity remain strong even after his time? So if we could have the group continuity beyond His Holiness.
I think we focused more on broader ideas about preserving our culture, especially as youth. A lot of us grow up in the Western world, like Kunsel said, and it's really important for us to continue doing things like Sunday school and staying in touch with Tibetans in Nepal and India, and thinking critically and staying educated about Tibet and China and external global issues that sort of reflect what's happening in Tibet. And we should help make that education a lot more accessible for people inside Tibet and non-Tibetans as well. We also want to encourage youth to engage and take agency to build community and a new momentum after the wave of Free Tibet movement in the 90s. It's important to keep that momentum because it was there and it can come again. Preserving culture and language, this will help us reclaim our identity and reclaim it both as a nation and as individuals, and use our privilege in the West, in exile, and our voices to speak out, be courageous, persevere, and learn, which are all qualities of a really good global citizen and advocate. And we should break silences and transform our language into action for the longevity of our community and movement beyond His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Last group, which is Buddhism and compassionate leadership. His Holiness often says, "My religion is kindness." His leadership has been deeply rooted in Buddhist values, especially compassion. In today's world, how can young Tibetans lead with compassion in ways that support both their own well-being and that of their communities?
So much for spending this wonderful afternoon with us. So our prompt, or the main question is, in today's world, how can young Tibetan lead with compassion in ways that support both their own well-beings as well as their communities? We discussed that the compassion and many of Dalai Lama's teaching has helped us in our own lives. It has helped us manage anger, stress at home, and guide us in how we treat our elders, partners, and our children. That has transitioned in us being able to deal with various stressful situations in our workplace and our community. As many of us work in healthcare, we find ourselves applying a lot of our religious values and compassion in dealing with difficult patients and empathizing with their sufferings. It makes oneself and our values strong so that we can support our community. Another way compassion has helped us is help us self-reflect our values and contrast that to that of our community and our country and the world. It has helped us define who we are as individuals, and that has helped us extend that to our communities. In conclusion, compassion and His Holiness's teaching has given us confidence and courage to lift oneself and others. Thank you.
We want to thank the facilitators who have led the discussions and of course the participants as well. We hope today's conversation has inspired you to reflect on how we can continue to support one another as emerging leaders in the Tibetan cause. We'll now open the floor for some Q&A. Geshey, if you would like to, have some time for reflections from the group presentations, that we can have that as well, or we can do that after the Q&A session.
Very briefly, I'm very touched by the ways in which you have looked at different dimensions of what you see as important aspects of the message that are coming from this book. So whether it is the relationship between Buddhism and Tibetan struggle and the values that are at the heart of Tibetan tradition and identity, or whether it is the challenge of how do we maintain the struggle beyond the lifetime of His Holiness as he has helped us prepare through democratization of the system, or whether it is to do with how can youth take on the mantle and carry the struggle forward, and what does it mean to be a leader. And here, I think, it is important to open up the concept of leadership, because sometimes in the Asian context, we tend to associate leadership with position and authority and status. Whereas in reality, some of the leaders never held an official position. Gandhi is a powerful example. Gandhi never held office, but he was one of the most powerful leaders of a struggle and of a people. So when we think of leader, we have to think outside the box, so that leadership need not be conferred on us as individuals. Leadership can be embraced by individuals who, one way or another, find a way to inspire their peers, and who can then inspire others to join in the movement. I don't know, some of you might have seen this beautiful YouTube where there is a demonstration of what is a leader means and what does a follower mean, and how the movement gains momentum when there is a critical mass. So leader alone is not enough. You need a imaginative, kind of an assertive voice, but you also need followers, who are immediate followers, which then gives a momentum. So we need to have much more sophisticated understanding of what leadership means. And one request I do have for the youth is to be smart. Constantly bombarding the world with Tibetan story is not the way to go. We lose our voice in a cacophony of noises that populate the social media world. The smart strategy is to seize opportunities. There will come opportunities. For example, when there is a major event on a global stage that has to do with China, whether it is a struggle or whether it is a visit of a major Chinese leader in town, there will be moments when a creative approach needs to be brought in. So because we cannot expect to have the world's attention on our cause all the time, that's unrealistic. It's way more impactful when the approach is smart. And especially, for example, one of the disappointments I have is when the book came out, there was a lot of reviews. But the reviews, if you look at the blogs, there's a lot of blogs coming from the other side, and there were very few responses coming from the Tibetan side. That's partly because we're not subscribing to important influential journals like New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or in those major outlets. So we need to have a smart strategy where when there is a major story unfolding, we need to be able to rise to the occasion. So my request to the young people is to have a much smarter strategy, so that, the 2008 Olympic protest was massively influential because it was timely. It offered us a powerful opportunity to amplify our voice in a simple way that the world can pay attention to. His Holiness's recent book has done the same. This has been way more influential than many years of us shouting, because the attention to this book attracted reviews and story, interviews and so on. So we need to be smart. We need to keep the narrative alive. In our own community, we need to do the legwork of keeping our language, keeping our culture, keeping our unity, having strategy, always maintaining a close connection with establishment in India, especially CTA. Don't be distracted by sometimes dissenting voices in the parliament. That is democracy. Let's not get distracted by this, but always keep the big picture in our mind. Make sure that the major communities like the Toronto community, Tibetan community, remains connected with our mother hub, which is in India. So long as establishment, CTA remains in India, that will be our mother hub. Wherever we are in different parts of the world, the communities need to be connected. And then in whatever way we can in our own place, when the opportunity arises, especially for the younger generation, because elder generations are not that quick. And also, sometimes the mastery of the language comes in the way. But the younger generation, you don't have that obstacle. You're swift, you're fast, you have the pulse of the culture and the time when you're easily, you go like this. And so then, if you are able to unite a voice when there is a strategic opportunity, that's how we keep it going. So that's one thing I wanted to share with you, so that we are, there is a saying, don't work too hard, but work smart. A smart strategy is way more effective than overwork, overtime work. So that's one thing I wanted to share with you. Thank you. There's one youth here.
Yeah, so we'll start with the youth and then we'll move back.
My question is, earlier you said that, I feel like China's main goal of invading Tibet was to gain our land and to gain our resources, obviously as colonialism goes. And China did this through cultural erasure of Tibetans and suppressing the identity of Tibetans to gain control over Tibetan people in Tibet. And so when Dalai Lama introduced the middle way path for China to keep its original goal of gaining Tibet's territory, but also keeping Tibet's cultural existence alive as a nation, as you said, why do you think China is not listening still at this point? I was just wondering that as you were talking about middle way. Yeah, that's my main question. Why do you think China is still not agreeing to this?
Thank you. This is really an important question because, letting go of claim for restoration of Tibetan independence was a major concession on the part of His Holiness. Because the right to reclaim independence still exists on the part of the Tibetan people, because Tibet was an independent nation when it was invaded. So the moral right and the international legal right still exists on the part of the people that was invaded. So now this is why His Holiness in the book says that he is disappointed, but he's also a little baffled why Chinese leadership did not take up on the offer he has made, the concessions he has made, because it is in the long run interest of PRC to resolve this problem in a peaceful way, because the problem is not going to go away. And His Holiness's conclusion in the book is that it's not that they did not understand what was being offered. The leadership just did not have the political will or the courage. Because it's always easier to stay with the status quo, we all know, than to be courageous and envision a different scenario. So His Holiness attributes it to that. Now, one thing we have to remember is, now this is here I'm speaking, not from the book, I'm speaking myself, okay? People's Republic of China, and before that, the Republic of China that came into existence after the fall of Qing dynasty was envisioned as a modern nation state. And until that point, China was an empire. Sun Yat-sen established a new Republic of China, and that all people who were involved in the establishment of new Republic of China were deeply inspired by French Revolution. Many of them were studied in France. Okay, so there was this romantic idea of establishment of a modern nation state. And in order to accommodate the territory, during the Qing Empire, at one point, Mongol and Tibet were part of the Qing Empire. And Qing is a Manchu dynasty. It was not a Chinese dynasty, it was a Manchu dynasty. The Republic of China came up with the idea of China, modern China, as a modern nation, multi-nation state. This is the vision of China, People's Republic of China inherited. The difference is, during the nationalist China, they did not try to forcibly make it real. PRC made it real by using force. So that's the difference. So I think it is, now this is my interpretation, it is too simplistic to read China's invasion of Tibet simply for territorial gain. There is a bigger story. That story has to do with the vision of modern China. China as a multi-nation state. That's why in the modern Chinese flag, there are 5 stars. One of the stars represents the Tibetan people. Okay, the big star represents the Han, the other stars represent Manchu, Mongols, and Uyghur. And similarly, the Republic of China, that is Kuomintang period, had a different flag that also has representations of different nations. So the history, the recent history before the invasion of Tibet by Communist China is a complicated one. So there is, on the Chinese part, there is also an emotional issue. So I don't think it's just territory. If it is just territory, it would be easier, it would be more straightforward. So there's a complexity in the history. So that's why I think, His Holiness's, the beauty and the wisdom behind His Holiness's solution is to say, okay, let's not get into the complicated history. Let's talk about the future. Everybody agrees, Chinese as well as Tibetans, that Tibetans are distinct people. Tibetans are not Chinese. Tibetans have their own language, own religion, own culture, own area. So everybody agrees Hans, Chinese and Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongols are distinct people with a distinct nation. So since everybody agrees on this, we can find a solution where actually we can create a modern-nation state, multi-nation state where distinct people, Tibetan, can survive and thrive. That is the power and the wisdom behind His Holiness's approach, which completely bypasses the complexity of history. Because the Chinese side is saying we need to have a similar position on history, and His Holiness is saying no. Solution of a political problem does not require that we agree on the past. We just agree on the future. And that, I think, is the great wisdom behind the middle way. And in the long run, it's in China's own self-interest. Because otherwise, they're going to have perpetually the same problem. You know, in His Holiness's book, there is a section where he says that one lesson we learn from history is that if you keep people perpetually unhappy, you cannot expect to have a stable society. That is true. The Tibetans are never going to be happy if they are forced to be Chinese. No Tibetan, His Holiness says, no Tibetan is going to say, I'm a Chinese. Why force the identity of a Chinese people or the Tibetans? There's no need for this. So I think the problem is going to remain. It's going to be one of those intractable, unsolvable problems for a long period of time. And it is our job to make sure that it remains that way until the resolution is found. You know, I have often said in my Tibetan talks, China has eaten Tibet, but it hasn't digested Tibet. And our job is to make sure it never digests Tibet. So that, in a simple way, that's our struggle.
Thank you so much for being part of this, session. And my name is Nima Dolma. I'm one of the Tibetan girl who came from Tibet at a very young age. So yeah, I couldn't see my parents since then, and now they are no more, right? So based on that, now I'm gonna ask you one question related with the Tibetan democracy. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has generously offered democracy to the Tibetan people and try to encourage our people for the participation and equality and shared responsibility. However, in practice, a democratic process within Tibetan communities often appear influenced by social bias, regional loyalty, or groupism. In light of His Holiness' vision of genuine and inclusive democracy, what is your advice to help overcome these divisions and ensure that our democratic culture truly reflects the value he upholds? Thank you so much.
Thank you. In a Tibetan text, a Galamba master, who says, if human beings don't fight with another human being, who else can they fight with? So, quarrel and arguments and disputes are very human behavior. But I do agree, and personally too, I'm actually quite sad to see sometimes the length to which this division and disunity actually can go to the point where sometimes our parliament in exile becomes paralyzed. There doesn't seem to be any solution to certain problems. But my own sense is, in a sense, at the moment we have a kind of luxury because His Holiness has established our institutions in exile in such a secure way that nobody feels that we are facing an existential threat. If there is a collective threat of the very survival of Tibetan community becomes obvious, I don't think we will be squabbling right now. So let's hope we don't have to wait until that point before we start coming together in some kind of unity, because everybody's ultimate aspiration is the same. It's the restoration of freedom to our people and high degree of meaningful autonomy for our nation. That is the aspiration of everybody. So then why waste so much time fighting about this or that? And so in a way right now, to be honest, for me it looks like people are a little spoiled. There's a kind of a lack of taking responsibility seriously. And there's a kind of a luxury because they feel that it doesn't matter that much. There's not much at stake. Maybe not now, but there might come a time where if our disunity is not resolved, the very survival of CTA and the Tibetan established community institutions in India and exile might be called into question. And at that time, it will be too late. And we would have done a great service to PRC by shooting ourselves. So that's one thing I worry. But my hope and my sense is that I don't think we will get there. I think at some point, the saner minds will prevail. There will be a unity because we can't afford disunity. It's just, we are such a small community. There's a Tibetan saying, "Mi baraka." So our community is just a baraka, we're only one handful. And even that, fighting among ourselves, is just looking from outside. It looks so stupid. So I hope that saner minds will prevail. And my own hope is that important voices like teachers and lamas and leaders would advise that we need to rise above our differences and to think of the common goal. And this is one area. Sometimes I do feel sad that His Holiness at his age, after all the efforts he has made, what he is seeing doesn't look that good. And this is like kind of a total disrespect to the legacy of your parents. So I do sometimes feel sad that at the moment there is this, but I hope this is only temporary. I hope this is not the norm. If this is the norm, we have a huge problem. And if that is because our charter is not making it possible to change, then we need to change the charter. Charter is designed by people, and if people don't have the authority to change the charter, when it doesn't work, then what's the point of charter? Charter is not a religious text. Charter is not Buddha's words that cannot be changed. Charter is not God's will. So if nothing works, then people will have to rise and revise the charter so that at least we could have a working system. So I hope it wouldn't get there. I hope people are wise enough to know that in the end, if the community collectively suffers, everybody suffers. So I just hope that saner minds will prepare and wisdom will come through, and then teachers and voices, important voices, will advise so that the voice of unity will be stronger than the voice of disunity. That's my hope.
Geshey, everyone, and thank you, Yankee, for the introduction. On behalf of the Tibetan Canadian Cultural Center, it is an immense honor to thank our esteemed chief guest and keynote speaker, Dr. Thupten Jinpa, for being here with us today. Geshey, you have not only helped bring the profound words of His Holiness to the world through your decades of translation work, but you have also continuously empowered younger generations with compassion, wisdom, and moral clarity. So thank you for taking the time to be here and helping us all connect more deeply with its messages. And I strongly encourage everyone, if you haven't already done so, please read this very important book. At this time, can I invite President Sonlangarla to offer a kata and a small token of appreciation to our Geshey for being here.
So before we end, why don't we all together join in the very simple prayer, long life for His Holiness, okay? 가리라베 고베 신랑데 펜다 데와 마르 중에 제레스와 텐지 여조이 샤베 시데 바도 땡요지.
We'll do a small presentation, a small thank you for being here with us today and being a keynote speaker. I also want to thank the incredible team of organizers who have made this event possible. So firstly, thank you to Thupten for being the pillar of this event and ensuring the success of this event. So please join me in thanking our moderators, Tenzin Yangila and Tenzin Kenzila. We also got Tenzin Tomo and Tenzin Sundula. And thank you to Yuden who couldn't be here with us today.